Hi, I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center, and this is The American Idea, coming to you from Peter Schramm's library in Ashland, Ohio. In this podcast, we explore America's crisis in civic education. Too many people today don't understand the history and principles that make us Americans. So we're here to explore America's history and principles and what they mean for today, what we can learn from them, and how we can restore them to their rightful place in our hearts and minds. We think it's the most important thing we can do as Americans to keep our experiment in self-government alive. So thank you for joining us in this important conversation. You can learn more about Ashbrook and the work we're doing with students, teachers, and citizens at ashbrook.org.
Well, I want to welcome everybody to our webinar this afternoon. Thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center at Ashland University. And those of you who may not know, Ashbrook is an independent educational center located at Ashland University here in North Central Ohio. And we run programs in American history and government for students, teachers, and citizens, both here on the campus of Ashland University, but also around the country. And this webinar today is really part of our educational mission, which is to help educate our fellow Americans, whether those are students, teachers, or citizens, in the history and founding principles of our country. And we also hope in the habits of reflection and choice, as the Federalist #1 puts it, that we think are necessary to perpetuate our republic. So thank you for joining us today for this webinar that is part of that educational mission. And we really believe at Ashbrook, as I always say, that education is not about just information, and definitely not about indoctrination, but about discovering the truth for yourself. We really root all of our programs in Aristotle's old maxim that all human beings by nature desire to know, and then we add, but they don't want to be told. They want to discover it for themselves. And we found that the best way to discover for yourself is through conversation. So we want to have a conversation today about a very important topic for contemporary American society, politics, culture, and a very important figure in American history. And to join us for that conversation today on Susan B. Anthony and her insights into the contemporary feminist movement and what it means for America today, joining me today for that conversation is Dr. Natalie Taylor. Professor Taylor is the chair of the Department of Government at Skidmore College in New York State. She received her bachelor's degree from Kenyon College, right here in the great old state of Ohio, and then went on to get her master's and PhD from Fordham University in New York City. Professor Taylor teaches a wide range of interesting courses at Skidmore. She teaches especially in political thought, in feminist political thought, and in American politics. And she also happens to teach for us and does a wonderful job teaching for us in Ashbrook's Master of Arts in American History and Government program. I was looking at some of the courses you've taught, Natalie. American Revolution, the Reform Tradition, Ratification Debates, but also a really interesting course entitled The Addams Family.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites.
So her range of knowledge extends across American history and politics, from the American founding to contemporary times. Mm-hmm. She's also a published author, has written articles and book chapters on American political thought, contemporary feminist thought, and also written a really wonderful book on the political thought of Mary Wollstonecraft, the British thinker who was considered one of the pioneers of feminist political thought in the Western tradition. Mm-hmm. Natalie, so thanks so much for taking the time to join us today to talk about Susan B. Anthony.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm just absolutely delighted to be here. I consider my affiliation with the Ashbrook Center and the MAG program, and more recently with the Teaching American History program, one of the sort of proudest elements of my career. So I'm really very grateful to always be invited to talk with you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. And for those of you who are joining us, if you want to get in on the conversation, use the Q&A function, please, to ask questions. We always try to get to as many of those questions as we can. If we can't get to them all, I apologize in advance, but we will try. I know there'll be a number of questions today. Natalie, to start us off, Susan B. Anthony. Some of us probably know she's on a coin.
Yep.
We've probably heard of her, but a lot of us, I think, don't know a lot about this figure who turns out to be one of the most important figures in American history, probably of the 19th and 20th century. Tell us a little bit about Susan B. Anthony, who she was, and then we'll perhaps get into a little bit later her effect on the modern feminist movement and whether they are inheritors of her or not inheritors of her. But just start us off with, who's Susan B. Anthony?
So Susan B. Anthony was born in February 15th, 1820, and then she died March 13th in 1906. So her lifespan, as you mentioned, really does encompass most of the 19th century. She's born to a Quaker family, which was conservative in many ways. I always make students a little nervous when I tell them that Quakers did not believe in dancing and drinking alcohol, but they were less conservative in other important ways that would have profound effects on her public life. They encouraged their daughters to be educated alongside with their sons. And they also allowed for women to speak publicly. And both of those things, I think, are going to be central to her ability to step into her public role. She did so on behalf of the temperance movement. So part of the 19th century reform tradition was an effort to limit the production and sale of alcohol. And Anthony recognized the pernicious effects that the drunkenness had on both the financial, sometimes the physical consequences for women. And so she sought to bring an end to that. And it wasn't long that she sort of realized if there really was going to be change, that women had to have the vote. They had to be able to pressure their lawmakers into making those changes. So that's how she begins her public career, how she dips her toe in women's rights. And this is all prior to the Civil War. And she ended up devoting her long life to it. As I mentioned, she died in 1906. Her friend and lifelong friend, I should say, and colleague, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, said that Susan B. Anthony, like John Quincy Adams, so here's the connection you're looking for, Jeff, would die, on the podium, and she practically did. She caught pneumonia on her way back from a women's rights convention, and died at her home in Rochester. So
that's fascinating to me. You're just saying that when we think of Susan B. Anthony, we do think of her as a suffragette, right? Fighting for the right of women to vote. But you're saying
That's
originally
right.
That grows out of her desire to spread the temperance movement.
That's right. Yeah. And we'll take a look at that document today, and what I believe is her strongest, most compelling argument for suffrage, and her most idealistic argument for suffrage. But her initial reasons for being drawn to the suffrage movement are really about a kind of pragmatic, utilitarian way to end temperance. She was also an abolitionist too. As
I was going to ask about that. So here's this woman before the Civil War arguing for the restriction or abolition of the use of alcohol because of bad effects. But also, is she involved? You said she's an abolitionist. Is she involved in other reform movements like the effort to get rid of slavery? And how do those things kind of mix together before we get to the Civil War?
Yeah, so there was a lot of crossover, I would say, between those and the temperance movement and in the abolitionist movement, a kind of general spirit of reform, particularly in upstate New York, where she was from, in the sort of central upstate New York area. And so made for, I mean, I can rattle off the list of little towns out there that, sound very charming and quaint, but you couldn't hardly believe that there would be the kind of, intellectual and activist power there. But there was. So it made for a very vibrant community. I've already mentioned Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Frederick Douglass was on hand, and a host of other reformers who were, working together to bring about change.
So the Civil War comes. Is Susan B. Anthony active in the women's suffrage movement before the Civil War?
Yeah. So she does link up with other women's rights advocates, and the first call or explicit call for women's suffrage came in 1848 in the Declaration of Sentiments, which was part of the document that came out of the Seneca Falls Convention. Now, Anthony wasn't there, but she soon, as I mentioned, linked up with some of those reformers, and that was considered pretty radical. There were a lot of people who had signed their name to that document, and then they said, "Oh, no, that's a bridge too far. I can't do that." They were sort of had greater success, let me put it that way, in advocating for property rights, for example, and had made some headway prior to the Civil War in the state of New York. But the Civil War came along, and it just didn't seem appropriate to advocate for one's own rights when the nation was in this crisis.
So what happens to Susan B. Anthony and the women's suffrage movement after the Civil War? It seems like with the Civil War comes an emancipation and the abolition of slavery, the extension of the right to vote in the 15th Amendment to all people regardless of color. It seems like this would accelerate the trend toward women's right to vote.
Yeah, it didn't. It kind of stalled it, and I guess I should say that I've been steeped in Susan B. Anthony for a few years now, and so I do have her perspective, and others should feel free to push back a little bit. But so it's sort of interesting. In the years following the Civil War, there had been kind of a reverse. Prior to the Civil War, women like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, middle class, educated women, white women, sort of gave credibility to the abolitionist movement, right? The abolitionists were, considered very radical, some in many cases. And so this kind of brought them into the kind of mainstream arguments. In the years following the Civil War, as you said, as Reconstruction is taking place and the nation is thinking about how to fold in the formerly enslaved people, that becomes pressing and central in a way that women's rights no longer were. And their continued demand for rights, including suffrage, and sort of advocating for those alongside of the freed people, made them to seem to be a little bit out of step with mainstream politics. And so, as you mentioned, the Reconstruction Amendments are ratified. The 14th Amendment introduces the word male into the Constitution. It's mentioned, the word is used 3 times, each time in relationship to citizenship. And so then it becomes necessary to pass the 15th Amendment. And Anthony was hopeful that the 15th Amendment could undo the damage that the 14th Amendment did. The Section 1 of the 15th Amendment reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." So Anthony was thinking, wouldn't it be just so easy to slip the word sex in there? And she had really pushed for that, but it wasn't to be. That amendment was ratified without that little tiny word. And as a consequence, she felt very daunted that a new amendment would have to be ratified in order to get the right to vote.
Well, that's fascinating to me because I don't think I or many of our listeners probably knew that the Constitution never says that only men can vote, but the original Constitution does not. But then in the 14th Amendment in 1868, much later, it implies that that's so. And so really, after the Civil War, you're saying there's a setback for Susan B. Anthony and the women's suffrage movement.
Yeah.
So what happens? Because this document that you and I talked about in our wonderful podcast episode on
that was fun.
Anthony, and that you've directed our attention to, has a really provocative title. And this is maybe one of her more famous speeches or letters, which is, and the title, if I've got it right, is it a crime for women to vote? Or for a citizen to vote, I guess. Yeah. Okay. How could it be a crime for a citizen to vote?
Well, we find out. What happens is, after the 15th Amendment is passed and she sees that it will not include sex as a category by which people can be prohibited from voting, she feels utterly deflated because she knows that now a new amendment will have to be introduced. And she gets the idea that perhaps the women's rights advocates can establish women's right to vote based on the 15th Amendment. They will advocate that they are citizens and therefore they should be allowed to vote according to this. And so the document that we have in front of us is her argument for including or protecting women's rights to vote based on the 15th Amendment. And again, this was a new political strategy to prevent the necessity of having to ratify a new amendment.
So this document, is it a crime for a citizen to vote? Was it a crime? Did she get arrested?
Yeah, so she comes up with the idea that, we're citizens. It says we can vote. Let's go do it, ladies. And so Susan B. Anthony, along with a number of women across the United States, went to their local polling places to vote in the 1872 election. And she was promptly arrested after voting. Well, promptly 3 weeks later, she was arrested after voting. And she was released on bail. Her lawyer couldn't stand to leave her sitting there. And so she was released. And so in that period prior to her court date, she made the round. She published several pieces in newspapers, and she also made several speeches across the state arguing that she had been wrongly arrested, that in fact women are citizens and therefore have the right to vote. Wow. And so the piece we have in front of us is an example of one of those speeches and essays that she had printed.
What does she say in her argument about why women should have the right to vote? What does she appeal to? What kind of argument does she make? I think this document is from the early 1870s, right?
Yeah. It's 1873 in the spring. So I think that this document is so well crafted and lays out our first principles as Americans and as a way of solving some, even I'd go so far as to solving some of the theoretical problems. So in the first part of the document, I see it as divided into two parts. Anthony offers an account of the philosophical principles on which the nation is founded and the ones that they echo the Declaration in many ways. So, for example, she tells us that our Republican government is based on the idea of the natural right of every individual to a voice and a vote in making the execution of the laws. And this follows from the kind of social contract theory that we see in the Declaration of Independence, that human beings are endowed with natural rights and they compromise those rights or mitigate them in some way in order to live peacefully together in political life. But so that would be true of women as well. as she says, they don't barter away their rights. They simply pledge themselves to protect each other in the enjoyment of them, which of course is the argument of the Declaration.
So she's saying that if a woman lived on an island by herself, she would have control of her own person and property, and she would be sort of voting, deciding for herself how to govern herself.
That's right.
She joins society. She doesn't give that right up.
No,
she maintains that right. And that right includes the right to vote about who's going to govern you.
Yeah, and so I think that she solves a theoretical problem that certainly Jefferson was aware of, right? If we think about the scenario you've just mentioned, that human beings have to make the conscious decision to live amongst others and make an agreement about how that's going to happen, that's very clear at the time of the Declaration, and the American Revolution, the ratification of the Constitution. But like all good, ordered, stable political societies, they are meant to outlast the generation that founds them. And so, as you know, and as I mentioned, I think Jefferson was really alive to that question. How do you assure that subsequent generations of citizens are consenting to their government? And I will leave it to Cara and other Jefferson scholars to address that question. But, you know, Anthony argues that it is the right to vote that sort of renews our consent in our government. By going to the polls, taking part in the decision making, then we are in effect consenting. And so as long as we do not have the capacity to vote, we are being governed without our consent. And of course, that echoes the no taxation without representation, which, you know, she explicitly deals with as well.
So it really, in this speech, if I'm understanding what you're saying, she's really looking back to the principles of the American founding, to things like the Declaration of Independence, and saying, hey, the American founders believed in consent of the governed. If you were going to be governed, you had to agree to govern. How do you show your agreement, as you just said? Well, by voting. So we're people too. So we're being governed. So we should have to consent. We should have the right to vote. This is 1873.
Yep.
Is that argument successful?
Not in 1873. So the second part of the document, she tries to establish that women fall under the category of those who have had previous conditions of servitude. And so she sort of lays out the case that, you know, because of course that phrase is referring to the former enslaved people. And so she's trying to draw a parallel that they don't have rights to property, they are taxed, you know, all of the ways in which they're sort of formed in servitude. Anthony never took her case to the Supreme Court because of some legal technicality. She wasn't eligible to appeal. However, other women who had voted that day did have their case taken, in Minor versus Happerstat is the case that finally decides it. And in that document, or in that the rhetoric that Susan B. Anthony and her colleague Elizabeth Cady Stanton used, you know, really got quite inflamed, and you know, just raising question of what does it mean to have the capacity to be self-governing? What kind of faculties are needed? How much education is needed? And you know, and they made comments that I think are rightly described as racist today.
So what this argument, as you say, it doesn't prevail at the Supreme Court. So in 1873, women don't have the right to vote in the United States. The suffrage movement, does it take off from there?
No.
What happens?
So it enters into a period that some scholars often refer to it as the doldrums. Susan B. Anthony, for example, retreats and begins to write the history of the suffrage movement. And, you know, volumes and volumes of writing on the movement. But it's really not until the late 1890s that the organizations come together, the women's rights organizations sort of regroup and make a further effort for to pass an amendment, which will ultimately be the 19th Amendment that's passed or ratified in 1920.
So really almost 40 years go by where there's not a lot of activity. And then, as you say, in the early 20th century, the women's suffrage movement really starts to becoming big. And I think lots of our listeners have probably seen, the old photographs of women marching and with the flags and riding in the cars, tooting horns and this sort of thing. And in fact, my parents are with us today, I'm sure, listening. And my grandmother, who was in Muskegon, Michigan, actually attended a suffrage rally, I think in 1918, when she was only 17 or 18 years old.
Oh my gosh, that is amazing. Do you know if I could take it up with your parents at another point. If maybe there's pictures available, I think we can. That would be fun to see.
If there were. But what it means is that for years and years and years, Susan B. Anthony's desire to give women the right to vote, which she believed was was only fair and what was their due. She dies in 1906. She doesn't actually see the passage of the amendment that secures women the right to vote.
Yeah, I mean, it's really very poignant. She knew it too, right? She knew as soon as that 15th Amendment was passed that it was not only, and then we get the Supreme Court decision that not only philosophically had she been defeated, but politically she had been defeated, because now there is, as she put it, millions more men that have to be convinced to to determine women's fate and allow them to vote. And so she knew that it would be another half century before this could be accomplished. And, throughout this time, she's gaining greater and greater national recognition. President Roosevelt used to call her, I don't know how he actually communicated, but he used to send his birthday wishes to her. She's like, I don't want happy birthday, I want to vote. And so she did have this national stature. When she died in March of 1906, there were thousands of people that attended that funeral as if she were a statesman. And, but she wore a pin that had been made for her of the American flag, but there were only 4 stars on that pin when she died, representing the 4 states that allowed women to vote. So it really was really very sad when she passed away without seeing her lifelong work realized.
Right. And it's interesting, right? Because we sometimes forget that just because the federal government it hadn't granted women the right to vote, some states, you mentioned 4 states, I think Wyoming was maybe the first, that allowed women at the state level to vote in federal elections.
That's right. The Constitution allows that the states could govern their own elections. And so some states saw that was important and allowed for it.
So why did Anthony think, as you mentioned, and it's kind of an important point not to forget, it was ultimately men who decided to give women the right to vote or to recognize their right to vote with this.
Yeah, I like that formulation better, Jeff. Yeah, right. I mean, that's more consistent with her philosophical argument, right? So I think that's, and I slip up too. So,
it's not a right you give, it's a right you recognize that people have.
Yeah,
Why did she think that she could persuade men to recognize women's right to vote?
Well, so this may be a longer answer than you were expecting, but I think that's the most compelling argument, as I mentioned, generally for Americans, right? It establishes the right or the protection of that right based on our philosophical principles and our first principles of this nation. And it's entirely consistent, I think, and had the best chance of persuading men to vote. And so I think rhetorically, it was really very important for her to do that. It was also, maybe practically, it was part of this legal case that she was in. We do see, though, throughout Anthony's lifetime and certainly throughout the course of feminism, that feminists have had the recourse to other arguments for women's right to vote, and that are somewhat different and maybe at odds with those principles of individual rights and freedom that we get from the Declaration. And so I thought maybe I could mention too, there are strains of feminism that want to emphasize women as part of a class or category that, and rather than as individuals. And so Anthony often availed herself of these arguments. As I mentioned, she first came into public life as part of the temperance movement. And at the time, it was very unusual for women to speak to an audience of both men and women. But there were exceptions, temperance, abolitionism, those moral questions, women were admitted to a public audience to speak because they had the belief was that women had a moral authority as women and therefore could speak. And I'm sort of reminded that today that is continues to be a thread or an argument in our discourse, our political discourse. I watched President Zelensky's speech to Congress this morning, and my own representative, Elise Stefanik, who is part of the Republican membership, spoke afterwards to the press. And she began noting that she spoke as a new mother. And she went on to condemn the bombing of the maternity hospital. And she sort of fiercely claimed that Putin was a war criminal and a thug and would be held accountable. And this was, I think, in a contrast to the other men who were speaking, who were perhaps more measured, more diplomatic. And I think there were probably women across America going, yeah, that's right, sister. You know that's right. Because women have a certain sensibility that they share as a class or a group. The second way, I think, that line of argument that Anthony doesn't choose to take here is still recognizing that women are a class or a category, is one that maybe is more pronounced in contemporary feminism, in which she makes the case that women have experienced harm or victimization because men have used their power to advance their own interest at the expense of women. And so that, she used those arguments quite a bit when advancing her temperance agenda, that, men certainly couldn't protect women if they were drunk.
Right. Yeah, of course. So that's interesting to me, because then with the passage of the amendment, securing women the right to vote, in some ways you don't really have a at least we don't think of having a feminist movement. Like maybe if that's the early American feminist movement, finally it succeeds. Women get the right to vote. But I don't think of the feminist movement, because this webinar is talking about sort of Susan B. Anthony and contemporary feminism.
Right.
I don't think of the contemporary feminist movement then as starting until decades later.
Yeah. So, there's been some good research on in wake of the centennial of the 19th Amendment on women's voting patterns. And we do find that in the years following the ratification of the 19th Amendment, that women maybe don't avail themselves to the right to vote as they might have been expected to, or that they don't vote as a class or a category in the way that feminists, including Anthony, had maybe predicted that they would. And so it really isn't until the early 1960s we generally look to the publication of Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique as the sort of first moment of this, what we refer to as the second wave of feminism in the United States that lasts in the 1960s and 70s.
So tell us about some of the arguments that the 1960s feminists, and some of our listeners will be familiar and have obviously lived through that time. Yeah. But what are their arguments? And you mentioned Betty Friedan as one example. There are many. What arguments are they making about women's role in society? And are they arguments that are like Susan B. Anthony's or not like her? Did they think of her as an inspiration, or did they kind of forget about her or turn their backs on her? What was that relationship?
Well, no, I don't think that they turned their backs on her. She had really become a sort of um, guiding figure, right? One we turn to, and with a kind of mythology. By the end of her lifetime, the younger women were referring to her as Aunt Susan. The 19th Amendment was named the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. So she sort of established herself in the sort of pantheon of importance of feminism. I would say that Betty Friedan, for example, and other women, sometimes we refer to them as liberal feminists because they do adopt the principles of liberalism that are entirely consistent with the principles that we've talked about with Susan B. Anthony. And they seek to expand the rights to women and the protections of government to women, and use the legislative process to do that. There is another strain of feminism that emerges in the 1960s, generally by younger women at the time, that wants to diagnose the kind of cultural, social, and political ways and forces that are at work on women's lives. And so that they don't see that the regular political process can resolve some of the ways in which women have been discriminated against. And so I think feminism always has these two threads in it, a kind of liberal thread that we get from Susan B. Anthony that has this attention to equality, freedom, personal sovereignty. I mean, I think that's at the heart of any feminist agenda. But then there are more radical strains, and Susan B. Anthony would have been familiar with them and articulated them, that will also sort of critique the current system as having these forces that are working on women that are to their detriment. And so as we look at various moments throughout the American experiment, we can see that these different threads are more or less pronounced. And I should add that women don't speak, with the same voice. While individual women will be persuaded by one argument more or less than the other.
Right, because I'm thinking, in my mind, and maybe it's just wrong to sort of put a label or a category on someone like Susan B. Anthony, but is she a conservative or is she a radical?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question, and I'm sure she was accused of very radical tendencies. All manner of nasty things had been said about her because of the way in which she, kind of violated the traditional notions of what it means to be a woman. But like you said, there's a very conservative element to her. She is adhering to the principles of our nation and seeking to be part of self-government. And so she doesn't want to tear down the Constitution in the way perhaps the Garrisonian abolitionists had denied the Constitution. So it's ambiguous.
So she really wants to kind of conserve the principles of our founding and extend them to women, and in the way that they're extended to men.
Yeah.
Did you see any difference? And I know, because I'm thinking about contemporary feminism, and there's a big debate, even today, like the Me Too movement.
Right.
There's a big debate among contemporary feminists about whether women should be treated the same as men, or whether they should be treated differently. What's the fair way to treat women in society? What was Susan B. Anthony's position on that?
Well, I think in the largely her position was that they should be treated the same, or at least equal. I mean, in that's the big challenge, right? How do we treat human beings that are different equally? And in the case of women and men, they are biologically different. Women have the capacity to bear children that has profound consequences on their own lives, the lives of their families, communities, and their nation. And so we want to sort of respect differences among human beings, but we also want to be able to treat them equally. And I think where you see those debates, Jeff, I think they're usually, motivated by the challenge of doing that.
So are there strains? You mentioned some strains of contemporary feminism today that you think in some ways may break from Susan B. Anthony's sort of founding principles argument. What are some of the arguments that you're seeing out there that you think would be kind of that kind of radical break from her?
Well, so I do think the emphasis that we maybe even culturally place on the condition of women today has moved away from understanding them simply as rights-bearing individuals who have agency and can determine the course of their lives if they're simply left alone from the government. And so I think contemporary feminism really even though I count Betty Friedan as a liberal feminist, she was the one that pointed out that all these images that women are getting in the magazines, their magazines as being harmful to them. So I do think we've shifted away, and today we think more about the ways in which the cultural, economic, and political forces are preventing women from, exercising their rights and their freedom. But fundamental is still the notion of, I think, consent. And so you had mentioned the Me Too movement. And ultimately, I think that is at the heart of it, obviously, that women do not want to have uninvited sexual attention or certainly not harassment, and they want to give their consent to their sexual behavior. But there are a number of forces, as the Me Too movement has demonstrated, that are preventing that. And it's not simply the law, right?
So one of the things that contemporary feminists have argued a lot about and disputed among themselves is marriage, and whether or not, if you're a feminist, you should be in favor of marriage or opposed to marriage. Did Susan B. Anthony talk anything about marriage and the role of women in marriage and the family? And how are her views maybe different, if they are different, from contemporary feminists on that?
Yeah, so Susan B. Anthony herself was not married, but she was not opposed to marriage. I mean, ironically enough, and I'll let everybody infer from this what they will, Susan B. Anthony never married. However, her friend, her best friend for 50 years, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, was married. She had 7 children. 7, I think that's right. And Susan was often on hand to help with the care of those children. So she was very supportive of her friend. Mr. Stanton wasn't around much, so it was important that Susan was there. And in fact, when one of her, I think it was her last child, was born, Elizabeth Cady Stanton sort of joked that she looks just like Susan, because she had been such an important part of that family. And she didn't write she didn't write as in opposition to the family as an institution in the way maybe some feminists of the 1960s and 70s did, and even maybe today. But Elizabeth Cady Stanton did, and that's the part, we all must draw our own conclusions. She had actually a more radical position, and was more critical of the family, of religion, and the things that held the family in place than Susan B. Anthony was.
So Susan B. Anthony was not opposed to what we call traditional marriage, traditional family. Contemporary feminism, you mentioned that. Is your sense today, and maybe this is an unfair question because there isn't contemporary feminism, there's lots of different thinkers and arguments, but is your sense that contemporary feminism has kind of made peace with the traditional family? I know that it was a radical sort of strains of it attacked the traditional family, as you said, in the 60s and 70s. Is your sense that it's made peace with that or not?
My sense is that it has. So one of the things that happens in our lifetimes was that Betty Friedan had an occasion to rethink, and others rethink their initial writings on marriage. So one of the things that Friedan kind of got herself into trouble with was to refer to the suburban home as a comfortable concentration camp. And
that's a very strong phrase.
Yeah, it was pretty damning, and she, I think, rightly got in trouble for it. She had much, less incendiary critiques of the family and the ways in which the family prevented women from moving into the public sphere and acting independently of the family. But she did acknowledge in her autobiography, when she went back to rethink those early years of the second wave of feminism, to say that the feminists got the family wrong, that was their weak spot, and that perhaps it had put off the next generation of women. So when I teach classes on women's rights or feminist political thought, I mentioned to them that I was born in 1969, really at the height of the women's movement. And, so that year, the Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, we can refer to it as Witch, Jeff, stormed Madison Square Garden with signs that says, "Always the bride, never a person. Here comes the slave off to her grave." So, marriage is under assault in the late 1960s. And then by the time that I graduated college in 1992, Time magazine had published a piece on, this generation of women who inherited all the rewards of second wave feminism and are the most, empowered generation of women to date. And while 94% of people, of women polled there at that, said that feminism had made life better, only 33% of women said that they would call themselves feminists. And so I think this inability to reconcile our personal lives with our public aspirations was part of that.
That's really interesting. And we've got some questions coming in now. And I just wanted to, one of them is from a listener who wants to know whether Susan B. Anthony had a strong opinion on the concept of Republican motherhood. The idea that women, especially from the American Revolutionary period, were responsible for teaching American values to children.
Yeah, so it's a good question, and it might be a little disappointing. So she doesn't, sort of rise to the level of Republican motherhood or imparting a notion of Republican motherhood that Abigail Adams does, for example. But we mentioned that this speech was in 1873. So already they're starting to think about the centennial of the Declaration of Independence. And I think it was something, that question doesn't really get as much attention in her writings as, let's say, the public element of women's lives, in part, I think, because of, that's where the attention has shifted. But I don't think, as we've talked about, she leveled a critique against Republican motherhood. She thought women did have an important role in raising children, especially children to be good American citizens. Sure. And that was both true of men and women, or female and male children. I think when we think about Republican motherhood, we think about, in large part, maybe because of Abigail Adams and her raising John Quincy Adams and others, that, it's how are we going to get these men to take their roles as statesmen, as defenders of the Republic? Whereas coming from a Quaker background, she was expected that the female and male children would be educated, and that in itself would lead to the necessary traits of citizenship.
So when you look at Susan B. Anthony now, in the light of the second wave feminism that you've talked about, and obviously the changes that we've seen in American society and government, what 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 strikes you about her or her legacy?
Mhm.
What really stands out to you?
Well, I would I will uh, say that I've been thinking about that quite a bit, and in particular with in context of the Me Too movement, which I think has probably been the most recent widespread reconsideration of feminist principles and activism. And I think what is so compelling about Susan B. Anthony and which sticks with us is this notion of consent. And so obviously Susan B. Anthony is thinking about that in the context of a political organization and when human beings enter into political life. But since you invoked Aristotle, we might as well just keep him in mind that he understood that a political regime was not merely the organization of its formal institutions, but that had, it permeated through social life as well. And so that question of consent continues to permeate our relationships among individuals on the personal level. And so I think as, being on college campuses and certainly in the wake of the Me Too movement, the most compelling legacy that she gives us is a notion about consent and what it means for human beings to interact with one another.
Yeah, and I'm struck by the idea that propelled my grandmother into the streets and marching, this idea that women have the right and ought to be and are full citizens who ought to be involved in governing themselves.
Right. And that is participating in the public institutions, but then also in their own daily lives.
Natalie Taylor, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. What a fascinating conversation about a person we've heard about, of course. I think she's on the $1 coin.
Yep. As a result of the second wave of feminism, too.
So. There you go, right? And yet we don't always know very much about this really compelling and important American. So thank you for taking the time to be with us.
I'm so grateful that you always indulge me. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming today and listening in. It's been a lot of fun.
And I would just let everybody know who's listening, you'll all be sent a link to a recording of this webinar. I want to just encourage you to share that widely with your friends, colleagues, children, grandchildren, anyone who needs to know more about this really fascinating American and her life and legacy. For more information about Ashbrook, please check us out on our website, ashbrook.org. For teachers who might be joining us today, teachingamericanhistory.org or TAH.org, a terrific site where you can find the speech that Professor Taylor was referring to. And also check out our podcast, The American Idea. Natalie and I had a wonderful conversation there about Susan B. Anthony and her life and legacy. So check us out there. You can find it on any of the streaming services for podcasts. Our next event, we're going to be honoring the end of the Civil War, continuing our American Idea webinar series in April with Heroes of the Civil War. You won't want to miss that. It's going to be a great conversation about some really important Americans and the wonderful effect that they had through that very challenging time. We really believe at Ashbrook that you can learn lessons of history and that you can renew your own understanding of what it means to be an American by having these kind of conversations. So thank you today for joining us for that conversation. We always think that renewal brings a new sense of hope in America and in this experiment in self-government. So on behalf of Ashbrook, stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay connected with Ashbrook. Thanks for joining us.
that man will ever make. He dies. Booth promised to kill Lincoln when Lincoln promised to extend the right to vote to former American slaves. And in doing that, not just in freeing the slaves, but in granting them the rights of citizenship, right? Lincoln is a martyr on the altar of liberty.
One question here about Frederick Douglass obviously had an influence on him. Just to both of you, just very briefly, would you call Frederick Douglass a hero of the Civil War?
Oh, absolutely. I think he's a hero of the Civil War. Yeah, after Lincoln delivers the second inaugural address, right? He goes out into the crowd and he sees Frederick Douglass, and he walks up to Douglass and says, "Right, there's my good friend Fred Douglass," and he claps him on the shoulder, and he said, "Mr. Douglass, what did you think of my little speech?" And Douglass's reaction is, he says, "Mr. President, it was a sacred effort. It was a sacred effort."
I think that's right. And Grant, there's always this question, would Reconstruction have ended differently? What would have happened had Lincoln survived? And I think we get an idea of that because Grant, you asked the question, what did Lincoln think of Grant? When Lincoln died, Grant, when the funeral occurred in the East Room of the White House, Grant sobbed like a little baby at the foot of the casket. I think the case can be made that Grant, to the best of his ability, carried out what he understood to be Lincoln's wishes for reunification. Grant is the one who backs the passage of the 15th Amendment, making sure that blacks had voting rights. He signs into law the act that establishes the Department of Justice in 1870 in order to combat the Ku Klux Klan, which had risen in the South and was intimidating black voters. And Grant crushed the Klan, not the Klan as we know it today, but these former Confederates that were operating in the South. He crushed them and made sure that the rights of citizenship to African Americans were realized by them after the war. This is what we had fought for. The election of 1870, 72, those were the freest, fairest elections in American history up until the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed. Because of course, Reconstruction ends after Grant's term. But this whole time, in a way, Douglass had been a sounding board and a conscience. I think not that Lincoln needed much help with conscience, but also a second conscience for Lincoln to advise him on things, and he was for Grant as well. I think they both tried to realize what Lincoln was talking about in that last address that he gave on the anniversary of today, and also in his second inaugural address.
Fascinating. One of the things we always talk about at Ashbrook is the importance of studying history through primary documents. So things like Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, if we want to understand the meaning of the Civil War. Things like some of Grant's speeches to his troops and as president, right? We say, don't read the textbook, read the primary documents themselves, dig into those and really have a conversation like we've been having, have a conversation with the past and try and understand those principles for yourself. But there are folks out there who have asked, what about your all recommendations for them who want to go on and think a little bit more about the Civil War, about Lincoln, Grant, Chamberlain? What are, Jason, you've mentioned the Gettysburg movie, but what are your favorite movies or books about the Civil War or speeches that you think, just very quickly, that you think folks should read? Jason, Pat?
Yeah. The movies, Gettysburg, Gods and Generals, especially the movie Glory. I would highly recommend the movie Glory and the new Steven Spielberg movie. I guess now it's not so new, but the new Steven Spielberg movie, Lincoln. Excellent films. As far as books go, again, Michael Sherer's The Killer Angels about the Battle of Gettysburg. Ron Chernow has a great 1,000-page beast of a biography on Grant. Came out in the past few years that is quite excellent. I'd also recommend, a couple of volumes from the Ashbrook Core Documents collection. We're currently working on a volume on the Civil War. Dr. Dan Monroe is working on that volume, and we have previously put out a volume on the causes of the Civil War. All original primary documents with introductions and study questions going along with all of those documents. I would recommend one other original source, but I have the feeling Maloney is going to take that. It's the best presidential memoirs in existence.
Pat, what are those?
Grant's memoir, without a doubt. You must read that if you want to understand the man and appreciate his greatness. It is amazing how well the prose holds up. It is clear writing. That's one thing that everyone remarked about Grant is, when you would read his orders, he wrote so clearly that and there was never any doubt that what he needed you to do, and that carried through into his memoirs, and the story behind the memoir and how it is written why it was written is fantastic. Mark Twain called it the greatest memoir since Caesar's Commentaries. Now Twain had some reason to sing its praises. He was responsible for its publication. Grant and his son had gone into business with the Bernie Madoff of their day, a man named Ferdinand Ward, who defrauded them and provoked an economic panic in the country. Grant and his family lost everything. And as they're going through this terrible financial setback, he discovers that he has terminal oral and throat cancer. And he had resisted every opportunity. His friend Twain had come to him and said, "Write your memoirs. I'll publish them for you." And he thought that he would be. He didn't want to seem like he was benefiting off of his service to the country. But when he lost everything, he needed a nest egg to keep his family out of the poorhouse. So in a race against time, he writes his memoir, and it holds up incredibly well. Maybe at the end it gets a little bit dicey because 2 or 3 days after he finishes the manuscript, he dies finally. And Twain actually sold the book on subscription before it was even finished. And as a result, Julia Grant got $400,000, which is, I think, about the equivalent of $16 million today, and kept. This was Grant's final battle, his last victory, and it was to save his family and record his experience of the war. But I think there's also the effect in there of his campaign in 1868 for president. The slogan was "Let us have peace," and I think he spent the entirety of his career thereafter trying to, in Lincoln's words, bind up the nation's wounds. And he writes very movingly of his southern opponents, and said, "Look, they fought for the worst cause that man ever took up arms for, but they fought bravely and honorably, and that is what we should celebrate: their bravery, not necessarily the cause for which they fought." And I think that it's just a wonderful, wonderful book. And there's a lot that I think can be instructive to us today when we wrestle with these questions about what caused the Civil War and how do we honor those that fought on the wrong side.
Thank you. That's wonderful to hear. And one of our listeners recommends Passing of the Armies by Chamberlain, which they say was published after his death. So great things to read from all of these amazing Americans. Thank you both for joining us so much. This has been terrific. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of everyone's questions. We had so many, but what a great topic. Very insightful. Thank you very much for joining us today. I want to thank all of the listeners, you all, for joining us. You'll be sent a link to a recording of this webinar. So if you want to hear it again and listen again, so many great details and stories, but also please send it to your friends, your family, your colleagues, anybody who you know who might be interested in this. And for more information on the Ashbrook Center, you can visit our website at ashbrook.org. For those of you who are students or especially teachers joining us, you can look us up at teachingamericanhistory.org or TAH.org. Great set of documents and wonderful help in the classroom for teachers there. And don't forget our podcast called The American Idea, which you can find at ashbrook.org or on any podcast streaming service where we have these kind of conversations. about the important principles and events and people who have shaped America and made it what it is today. So we have more webinars coming up on May 9th. We're going to be celebrating VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, and what we can learn from our victory over Nazi Germany. And on June 13th, we'll be talking about Ronald Reagan and the fight for freedom. So please join us on those events. We really believe here at Ashbrook that by studying heroes like these three and understanding the principles for which they fought, we can gain insight for today, and we can renew our own understanding of the principles that make us who we are as Americans. And we really believe that that kind of renewal of our understanding leads to hope, and ultimately to an understanding, a more deep and hopeful understanding of who we are and what we are as a country. And as always, thank you for joining us. Stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay connected with Ashbrook. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of The American Idea, a production of the Ashbrook Center. We're here to explore America's history and principles and what they mean for today, what we can learn from them, and how we can restore them to their rightful place in our hearts and minds. We think it's the most important thing we can do as Americans to keep our experiment in self-government alive. So thank you for joining us in this important conversation. If you enjoyed this podcast, please give it a 5-star review and like, follow, or subscribe on your platform of choice. You can learn more about Ashbrook and the work we're doing with students, teachers, and citizens at ashbrook.org. Thanks again for joining us.